Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Needs Some Introduction. Sona and I are back again, just shortly after, just the day after recording our recap of the finale of the agency, thrilling finale. So do catch up on that show if you happen to have Paramount Plus or want to get a free trial period, because you can binge the whole thing. But today we're here to discuss the second episode of the second season of Severance. Last week, the episode was called Hello, Ms. Cobell. Today, this week's episode is called Goodbye, Mrs. Selvig.
I didn't realize that.
A couple of things I want to correct in my, or not correct, but just add some detail to what I mentioned last week. I had mentioned that Ben Stiller had directed that first episode, and for the first season, he had, I think, directed half or almost half of those episodes. We're just in episode 2. I didn't know this because the credits are at the actual end. I assumed this was Stiller because it very much feels of a piece of the other episodes. But this is actually a different director, Sam Donovan. I think he did an excellent job here. Beautiful, dark, noirish photography here. You can see the bigger budget and these this incredible shot where you see it in the trailer too, where Helena, Heli's Audi, is walking across this walkway that connects two buildings. It's just this beautifully photographed sequence. Very architectural, very much feels like these kind of conspiracy thrillers. It has that sense of almost like a spy show. And we could get into that in some details. They're definitely winking at these more traditional spy films in their styling, even though, of course, that is not what we're seeing here. I'm specifically bringing up Milchik on his motorcycle, something out of Mission Impossible, with that very cool helmet, which is called out at one point. Oh, and one more thing I want to bring up is I mentioned that Dan Erickson seems to be the writer on all these episodes, but usually by now they would probably have a writer's room. And traditionally with a writer's room, like if you think about Breaking Bad, what they would often do is they usually write the scripts together, but they'll have one writer in charge of each particular episode so that they get their names on there. It's good for their resumes. It's good for Emmy nominations. It's good for collecting royalties eventually. And we definitely are seeing that here because it's not Dan Erickson showing up in the writing credits. It is Mohammed El Masri, who's done a bunch of mostly British TV. But I just wanted to call that out that, sometimes some of these writers will write the entirety of a show. And I did mention that I believe that was the case. Does not seem to be the case. He probably has a writer's room, completely normal for these type of big budget shows. Sona, let me mention one little thing that came up in the news, and then I'm going to get your general impressions of this episode. A little thing that came up in the news. It's hard to get actual information on how these shows do streaming wise. So some companies have popped up that use different kinds of technology, usually mobile apps, to track people's streaming habits, etc. And one of them is called Parrot Analytics. And it's one of the sources for when people say this is streaming shows doing well or not. Unlike the olden days when we used to see the top 10 shows on broadcast TV, there really is no standard for Nielsen still provides ratings, but they're day of ratings. And that means nothing because most people will not watch a show for days, weeks, months after they're on the air. So it's very hard to know when something's an actual hit or not. So they published a report this week, which I found very interesting. I want to bring it up here. They looked at how much value Severance had generated for Apple TV.
I think I did see these headlines now that you mention it. I didn't click them, but I did see them.
But maybe I read it for you there. There you go.
Thank you.
A couple of things that we kind of expect based on the trajectory of that show, even in our ratings when we covered it here on a podcast, that the show had generated $200 million in new activations for Apple TV when they think about baked in revenue from subscriptions. So it generated about $200 million of value to Apple TV. Also very interesting was, as you would expect, that the vast majority of that money came after the finale of the show, because we know how that, when the finale happened, that the show had already been building buzz, but after that, the buzz on the show just exploded, right? And then when people scratch their heads and go, oh my God, I can't believe they spent $200 million on the second season of Severance. Was it really worth it? These numbers would indicate that maybe it was. And that $200 million, by the way, is a little exaggerated. There was the shutdown during the writer's strike, which added a lot of overhead. There were still COVID protocols when they began shooting the show back in 2022, which added to the budget of everything, movies as well. And also that apparently there were some contracts that were signed for a third and fourth season, plus a lot of sets were built to be reused for following seasons. But regardless of whether that money is going to be doled out over multiple seasons. They obviously spent a lot of money, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if this is their most expensive show at this point, considering $200 million for 10 episodes, incredibly expensive. But apparently very important for Apple in many ways, perhaps if these numbers bear out, breaking even or even profitable for them. I wanted to bring that up also in the fact that they, of course, in this same article, announced what other shows generate for Apple, which I found very interesting. Mm-hmm. One was that Slow Horses has generated about $190 million, which sounds very good, except for the fact that that show's been on for 4 years. So that's spread out over 4 years. But it also is very inexpensive, and they produce it with the BBC, so they're not on the hook for most of the financing for that. So that sounds like a net winner for them. And I don't know if you watched this show, Sona, but this one wasn't that surprising to me. Generating about $300 million of revenue for the company is The Morning Show, which, however, is over the course of how many seasons has that been? 3?
You're asking the wrong person.
Oh, you don't watch it? Okay, I thought you might have watched it.
No, it's always been on my list of things to watch, but I haven't. But yeah, I feel like it's at least 3.
And so that $300 million is over the course of 3 seasons minimally, maybe even more. And of course, also that is an expensive show when you consider what those people get paid. So once again, in the grand scheme of things, maybe Severance isn't as expensive as it sounds. And of course, least surprising to me in all these statistics is that the 3 seasons of Ted Lasso, and of course, they're trying to make at least one more or a spinoff, has generated well over $600 million for Apple. So, I mean, how many people do you know, for example, that never watched Apple TV until they were watching Ted Lasso on Apple TV? So the proof is in these statistics, at least.
Yeah, well, I know at least for Ted Lasso, at one point I was gifted a little tin of mints with the Ted Lasso theme to them. So there's like a merchandising aspect for that show as well.
I don't even know if they included that in it, but that's a good point. And I do wonder, not on this list here, but I do really wonder about something like Shrinking, which is also popular, nowhere near as popular as Ted Lasso, but of course features some of the same talent as Ted Lasso, but still is a pretty big hit for them. Maybe one of the few shows that actually shows up on those Nielsen streaming charts on a regular basis, other than Lasso did, which was always like number 1 for a period of time. I think one season of Ted Lasso was the most streamed show in America for the whole season. So Shrinking is nowhere near that. But when you consider, I assume Shrinking is not an incredibly expensive show to make. You're probably making money for them as well. And of course, that is coming back for a 3rd season. All right, that's the only thing I saw in the headlines other than conspiracy theories around this show itself, or theories around it.
Oh my goodness. Well, I try and avoid them, but it's become impossible because the algorithm knows you.
Of course. Of course.
And so I, against my will, read more about Severance than I meant to.
I do have a whole episode, by the way, where I, here on the podcast, was speculating on season 2 and my rewatch of season 1. And unlike even things like Lost, which feel like they were spinning their wheels and there's even clues that don't really make sense, I think this is a very logically well-constructed overall conspiracy, because things that I speculated on in that episode are already bearing themselves out. And most importantly, Sona, we have to talk about the new credit sequence. I'll save it for a little bit later in the conversation.
Oh my gosh. I was
so many Easter eggs in there
to see that. There's too much happening.
Yes. This is part of my rewatch right now. I just rewatched this right before we started this conversation, and I needed to go frame by frame practically in that new credit sequence. And I'll give you some of my observations.
Also, as an overall comment, I want to say I am growing concerned because, yes, we have this podcast where we talk about this show, but in my opinion, I myself am a very amateur TV viewer. Yes. I think that's typical. Many people who watch TV, I find the shows that I like, I'm interested in them, and I sit and watch them, and I do try and pay them a little extra attention when I know that you and I are going to discuss them. I feel like this one has a very big chance of getting away from me with the Easter eggs and the inside jokes. I feel like it's going to take on, if it hasn't already, this Lost kind of feeling of like everybody and looking for references upon references. And in fact, one of the things I learned against my will was that the locker numbers in this show correspond with the lotto numbers that Hurley played on Lost.
Oh my God.
These are the types of things that are beyond me. Okay. I just want to put out there, I'm going to do my best, but I can't operate at that level when I watch this show.
Well, I would say two things to that. One is that's why we're here, or why I'm here for you, Sona, and hopefully our conversation will
Thank
enlighten
goodness.
viewers who are watching this more casually. And the second thing I would say is this is appointment TV for me and my wife. And when we discuss immediately afterwards, I'm going to try to balance those two points, because my conversations with her are not about all the Easter eggs. My conversation with her are really
Right.
about the character motivations, which I do want to focus on, because what I want to like take the pressure off of you to some extent. I will go down some of these rabbit holes, but this is what I've done in other conspiracy like shows we've covered here. I honestly will do some Reddit research, but if I don't think that that particular Easter egg doesn't add something thematically to the characters or to the themes, broader themes of the show, like I don't really care if they're referencing another TV show, for example. That's the type of thing I really don't care about, right? I do care about when I think that they're dropping a hint as to someone's character's true motivations, for example. That I think is more interesting. So I'll try to balance those two things to bring in some of the conspiracy theory stuff, but I don't really even want our conversations to just be spinning out all. I mean, there's so many theories now spinning around the show. Like, I mean, you could spend the whole episode just talking about that. When honestly, what I found fascinating in this episode, I want to get your general impressions, were really these two centerpiece moments. One is Heli watching that video, which is absolutely incredible scene. And the other one was this scene that hit me emotionally for some strange reason. And maybe we can get into it here in more detail. But it's the second conversation that Milchik has with Mark when he's trying to lure him back to work, where his
sister is so protective, right?
Yes. Yeah. That first, I mean, both of those conversations, all the interactions with his sister. And then, of course, when Milchik has him one-on-one and he's talking about his innie. And once again, this manipulation that we see even in this episode multiple times, an honest emotional reaction to something, which is yet the thing that is being used to manipulate the person. In a funny way, surprisingly, it intersects with some of the conversation we had about the agency yesterday, right? How you use the reality of a situation as a manipulation, and definitely happening here as well. But before we get into all the breakdown, I have so many notes, like I mentioned.
I can imagine.
Individual points. What was your general impression of this episode?
I loved it. Last week when we talked about what we'd like to see next, both of us agreed that it makes sense to see the outside world next and what happened after all of this and how it all played out. So I was really excited that they got right to it and that we got to see pieces of everybody's outside life. There was stuff to laugh at. There was stuff to cry about. I would like to know what kind of door you would be if you could be any kind of door.
I love that. That conversation is great. Yes.
So yeah, I thought it was great. How about you?
Oh yeah, I love this for all those things that I am caught up emotionally in those moments. The two standouts, like I said, were both moments that hit me emotionally. And yet there's the intrigue over what's the mystery? What does Irv know? He obviously knows a lot of things. His outie.
He's so charismatic in the outside world, isn't he?
Right. So different from his innie. Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is something, once again, the things that I do find interesting in this type of show, where you see, we've already talked because we've seen so much of Mark, where you see his innie is such a muted version of this sarcastic, wisecracking, unorthodox type character he is around his sister, for example, where we feel like that's probably the version of him closest to that he was when Gemma was alive. And then, of course, you have Heli, who is, and we got it. I mean, this has so much to talk about Heli. Heli is so constrained by the responsibility to this company. And then she sees this free spirit version of herself as her innie. It's an incredible reversal and so shocking to me that I'm like, wow, the person inside is more free in some ways than she is on the outside. And she gets to watch it on TV like it's reality television or something. It's incredible and so smart, from the point of view of the way to structure this show. You think about these motivations of why would someone have this innie, and now we see a whole different perspective where she is vicariously living through that character. It's an amazing twist.
Since we touched on Heli, can I just get out there with one more thing that
Sure.
I referenced yesterday?
I did jump ahead, but yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, and I started to say this when we were talking about the agency, but obviously it has no place there. Last week when we talked, I was fascinated with the idea that Heli could kind of be a double agent, tying it back
Yes.
to, to the agency. But then after we talked, I started thinking about, a lot of my evidence was she's made up this crazy story about the night gardener in the winter that she talked to, and she's too much detail on the clothes. And obviously all of that is a lie. But then I started thinking over the course of the week before I watched this episode, maybe she has grown to like these people and depend on them and enjoy them so much that she doesn't want to admit who she is, because obviously the reaction would be, well, not obviously, I assume the reaction would be shock and disgust. So maybe she lied because she doesn't want to admit it.
I completely agree with that. That, I think, is what's so fascinating about how that scene is written. And again, the show is incredibly smart and lets us be in that in-between state again. We'll get to it at the very end of this episode. I thought we were going to get the answer as to whether this is her innie or her outie, but the show intentionally does not show us her character going through that perspective change like we've seen when Mark or Dylan or Irv go through the elevator, because they're trying to keep that still hidden from us. So it forces us to think about who she is in that moment. And I totally agree. I think as it is written, our assumption is supposed to be on its face that she's lying to them because she doesn't want to let them know. Like you said, imagine she said, well, actually, let me tell you what I am. I'm one of the Egans. And if she's going to come forward with that in this moment when they all just went through this trauma, they would look at her like, oh my God, can we even trust her? So like you said, she wants to maintain the relationship she currently has with them and doesn't want to reveal herself as even unintentionally this evildoer.
Yeah, and the inside version of her could still be coping with that reality as well, right?
Right.
So
it's only if we take it at face value, she's just made this revelation minutes before, right?
Yeah.
On face value, she is being an honest broker, but then there are other, I've had many conversations in the past week with multiple people that are all saying, Heli, she's a fake, she's a poser. And by the way, I think most people feel like she is the outie Helena. And I don't buy that because her story doesn't seem rehearsed at all. And Helena wouldn't have had like minutes to make up this story. She would have been prepping for this moment. You have to imagine when she comes running through the door, she is pretending to be coming right from that previous experience. So if she's got all that planned out, she hasn't come up with a cover story. Like, I don't buy that, right? And the cover story, of course, sounds like something an innie would say, not an actual experience. I found a gardener in the middle of the night. Doesn't really make sense, right?
Exactly. True. I'm fascinated by your pronunciation of Helena by putting the emphasis on the second syllable.
Did I say Helena? Like that's like I'm thinking of isn't Helena out? I mean, in Washington.
Oh, Mount St. Helens? Mount St. Helena? Mount St.
Helena? Oh, Montana. Helena's in Montana. Yeah.
Either way. It just
it was out there towards the west somewhere.
Teasing you a little bit. That's all.
So yeah, let's get into the episode. I'm going to try to walk through it, and we can jump around, by the way, because there's so much to cover. Let me start at the start. We're seeing this episode is basically overlapping with episode 1. We have the same opening sequence where we hear the events at the end of season 1. But of course, we're with the outies in this particular case. Mark Scout wakes up at his sister's. I love the interactions between Devin, and great chemistry with this cast. It really feels like this is really his sister, the way they talk to each other. And just that her saying, oh, so this is you now? And just all of this, I just thought was so well done. This actress, by the way, which I haven't called out enough, she's terrific playing Devin. And I think she's going to be a bigger part of this season of the show.
I agree with all of that. And it almost makes me want to rewatch the first season, because I chose not to do that, to see if this dynamic was as lovely in the first season, because I don't remember noticing it then, but I definitely notice it now.
Oh, yeah, I would recommend that. She is terrific in the first season. There's just very little of her, but I think about the scene where he's making fun of Rickon and how she has this eye rolling every time Rickon says anything. But there is also this real sweetness between them. It is really worth watching again. Once again, this actress is doing a terrific job. I did not, in my conspiracy theory episode, my analysis episode of season 1, discuss Devin's name. I did discuss everybody else's name, but I want to do it here for a moment because, first of all, Devin means divine in French. So divine scout, and there's a lot of Mark Scout being a scout, right? He is investigating this underworld.
Sure.
And speaking of investigating underworld, when she says, "Oh, are you really Mark? What's my name?" What does he say? He says Persephone.
Persephone.
Persephone was kidnapped by Hades and taken to the underworld. And her mother, in this case, I don't know if there's a mother character coming in this show. I don't think so. But she's rescued by her mother, who thinks she's dead, and reclaims her from the underworld. But Persephone, in that period of time, has been tricked and is now married to Hades. And Persephone, for the rest of her life, must spend half the year in Hades underground and half the year above ground with her family. So half and half. Persephone, underworld, severed floor. I'm just saying words now.
Free associating.
I'm just scatting now.
I'll show you some ink blots next. We'll see where this goes.
Exactly. But anyway, the names in this show are very, very important, obviously. And I think there's layers to them. I don't think this is going to be like a one-to-one corollary, but obviously bringing up Persephone and the underworld and someone who spends half their lives above ground, half their lives below ground. Obviously, all of this is very intentional. Meanwhile, Heli wakes up, or I should say Helena wakes up outside of, or Helena. How should I pronounce this? Helena.
Yeah, go with the last syllable, just to keep us on our toes.
Just to be unique. She wakes up on the outside. Incredible. Britt Lowry, such an incredible actress, I think. Now adding a whole new shading to her, playing this outside character. All of this is really interesting. You see her run into her dad. Of course, this is immediately after the events that have occurred. But before we get into her interactions with her dad, what do you think of her? The first time we see her, she is massaging her neck. Heli obviously tried to hang herself. So what did you make of that moment? Other than noting that Britt Lowry has a very long neck.
Also, I just want to say her skin is absolutely beautiful and luminous here.
Yes.
Which it probably was last season as well, but I really noticed it in the close-ups of her in this particular episode. You can't really separate your lives into two separate spheres. And this point was made in the episode that one thing carries over into the other, right? So whether it's physical, emotional, psychological, there is an overlap there. And I think that's like a physical recognition of the overlap. What were your thoughts about it?
Oh, I think it's a fascinating reminder that she was just recently inhabited by that character. And of course, that character, Her Innie, has had the experience of hanging not very long ago when you think about the amount of time that separates those limited periods of time she's inside of that body. She disappeared for a long period of time when she was in the hospital in the Audi form and then returned to work not that long before the events of today. So it's like you said, it's as if the Innie, like the ghost of the Innie being in there and the pain of the hanging is still haunting her. So it's intriguing.
It's also reminding me, there is this popular book, it probably still popular, called The Body Keeps the Score. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's not really so much talking about physical trauma, but the idea that all of these things that happen to you are indelible in who you are. And if you don't work out your issues relating to them, they will keep arising in one way or the other because your body knows, as much as you're trying to shut it out, all the things that have happened to it. Your body and your mind are keeping track of those things.
By the way, The Body Keeps the Score. If not that book, then that general philosophy is absolutely on the mind of the creators of this show. Absolutely. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book. Full disclosure, I never quite finished it, but I feel like I got three-quarters of the way.
I never finished any nonfiction book, by the way.
It's so hard. Why is it so hard? I think because they're all too long, because in our short attention span society, which I am certainly a victim of, we can't do it. I guess a fiction book, you want to know the end of the story. But in a nonfiction book, you reach a certain point where you're kind of like, yeah, I get it.
I have a very cynical theory of that, by the way. I have a theory on everything, and I do have a theory on that as well. The reason I never finish a nonfiction book is because all nonfiction books have to be formatted in a particular way. All the same editors edit the same books exactly the same way. They all have to be a certain length. And my experience is you read the first chapter of the book, it tells you everything that's going to be in the rest of the book.
Yes.
And then every other chapter is a section from the first chapter with some more anecdotal evidence.
Right.
Eventually you just get tired of the repetition over and over again. That's basically what it is.
I think that's fair. Not to take away from the point of the book, which I have personally found to be very true, that you carry these traumas with you and you build upon them and you become re-traumatized. And so there's probably some of that happening here.
Now we got to talk about her dad walks in. First of all, very strange that all of the Lumen higher ups look like they're Mennonites or something. And this includes Selvig, by the way, who went to this school. I don't know if you remember all this from season 1. We see a graduation diploma from the Egan Girl for Schools, School for Girls. Oh, before I forget, I keep mispronouncing this actress's name, and I know someone's going to complain about it. So it's Britt Lauer. I'm sorry, I said Lowery. But anyway, Britt Lauer. Someone will definitely call me out on it. So I just want to make sure I get it out there. And she's excellent in the show, of course. But very strange how these people are styled, look old-timey. They remind me of Mennonites. Most of the men have these beards, including the Cure in all of his animations and his statue. But not her dad. Interesting. Right. Her dad is not James, weird name. It reminds me of, I don't know, this is a total aside, but James Gum from Silence of the Lambs, right? Not James.
Yeah.
That's a name I didn't analyze. Maybe I should look that up. James itself. All this is to say he's only there briefly in this whole entire episode, but he walks in disappointed at Helena.
So disapproving.
And calls her, it's not her fault, right? But calls her fetid moppet. What a combination of words.
He is obviously very disapproving and very disappointed. Then again, based on what we just saw, I kind of get it.
Oh, yes. Yeah, this is, of course, a shocking turn of events. Just loved this term, fetid moppet, which, I actually looked it up to see the actual official definitions of both of these words, which are so funny because fetid is decayed, grotesque, and moppet is like a term of affection a little child, right? So like repulsive, sweet little child.
I still love you, but right now I'm disgusted.
And maybe, hey, duality, right? These two very different things. Of course, the duality of the two characters within Helena herself. And maybe he understands that better than anyone else. It's funny. At first, I was thinking he shouldn't be disapproving. She had no control over it. But this is a version of her, right? Who, given the same criteria, is repulsed by their very mission.
To use a phrase from probably about a year ago, she did not understand the assignment, right? Like they put her in there so that they would have someone saying, it's all wine and roses. Everything is beautiful. Life is beautiful down there. We should all want to live like this. And instead she comes back with this screed about how it's a human rights violation.
Exactly. And then we have one of so many. I mean, so many of these one-on-one, almost it's a collection from scene to scene of one-on-one conversations between different characters to different effect. And this first extensive one we have is Helena and Cobell. This is so disrespectful to Cobell. She should be outraged by this. They have fired her. She was right about all the warnings she gave them. And even now, when she was there to warn them and they ignored her and this catastrophe happens for them in public, they just do the usual. It's very much feels like spin control where they're like, oh, thanks for coming forward. We're hearing you. We're listening to you. And she's like, great, put me back on the severed floor. And we got to talk about that, how she desperately wants to get back to that severed floor. Instead, they're like, no, we're going to put you on this advisory panel, which of course we've seen this throughout the recent history. There's a whole episode of Atlanta, by the way, about how these companies are trying to approach these different celebrities who represent something in the culture and then bring them in on the advisory council. Like, how can we do better? How can we do better? So it really feels like that kind of pablum of just like, oh, thanks for helping us out here. We really do appreciate it. Let me put you on his advisory council. And she's just like right away sees through this. Like, I've never heard of that before.
Exactly. It exists as of 30 seconds ago. Yeah.
Exactly. It really is surprising to some extent because I had speculated in that analysis episode that this was part of the controls of Lumen. They understood that this was a possible outcome and that even firing Cobell was a way of seeing the limits of control. Like that is part of this study that they're doing of controlling people. It's not just the innies, it's also the managers of the innies. So they kind of suspected some of these things would happen. But when you see them here, they seem really angry about what's happened. And they're saying we need to find out what everybody knows, fire those people if we need to. They send Milchik out to collect information on what everybody knows about the incidents of the night. So they really do seem to have been caught off guard. So the person who raised the alarm gets so mistreated by them. And of course, she feels deeply offended by this. But why do you think they're treating her so badly?
I think they still are dissatisfied with her, but they can't overlook that she has a lot of knowledge and a lot of value that they want access to. So maybe the ambivalence of that, right? When you know that you need somebody, but you dislike them. So you don't know what to do about it.
I can't really understand it, to be honest. I guess one generous way I can read it is that they do blame her, even though she did raise an alarm, that she was in charge of them while this was happening. And maybe she didn't, they could just be blaming her like she didn't do enough. Or the other part is maybe there's some commentary here. A lot of times you see this in companies where the whistleblower eventually bypasses the company because they're not listening to them and raises an alarm and in a way rescues the company from their own self-destruction. But then in the end, they don't appreciate it. They're like, you embarrassed us in public, right?
Yeah.
In a way, you get blamed for, like no good deed goes unpunished type situation. Because sometimes even when someone needs to be rescued, they don't appreciate it when it happens, right? So I'm assuming that's probably what we're seeing here.
Possibly also wanting to keep her in her place, not let her get too big for her britches kind of idea.
That's true, because there is part of the conversation where she says, you are afraid of us. And they say, we're not afraid of anybody. But I don't know if that's true. And maybe that you're right, that they're trying to continue to play this part, that this is all under control. And maybe they don't like her knowing that this is not as under control as they think.
Yeah, kind of, we're doing you a favor by agreeing to accept you back.
And of course, Milchik heads out looking really stylish. Love that jacket. Another great jacket.
You're obsessed with the jackets people wear when they ride motorcycles. I expected you to.
I think I want a motorcycle. I got to tell you, I
yesterday.
think I want a motorcycle after the agency. Except
you don't want the jacket. You want the motorcycle. Or is the motorcycle a means to the jacket?
Exactly. I need the motorcycle so I can say I can pull off the jacket if I'm riding a motorcycle.
Right. Otherwise, you're wearing the jacket and people are saying, hey, where's your bike? And
where's the motorcycle?
You
exactly.
don't have a motorcycle. Awkward.
Yeah, awkward. I did start to change my mind when he got hit on the bike at the end of the agency. I'm like, oh yeah, that's an outcome as well. I'll just ride it around the block.
Yeah, I mean, I've had this conversation many times with my husband. Motorcycles are statistically extremely dangerous.
Oh, my wife, same. She works, obviously, my wife works in a hospital. She would never let me get a motorcycle. Yeah. She has seen too many traumas from that. So Milchik out on his bike with this very cool helmet, as they mentioned. It's that matte helmet, which is very cool, actually. Even Rickon mentions that later in the episode. Heads out. We see him quickly meet up with Bert and with Dylan. Oh, a couple of interesting points about who wants to be there or not. Let's go back to Miss Cobell / Miss Selvig.
Cobell Vague, right?
Yeah, exactly. Great name they came up with for her. She actually wants back in there, and also speculating on that she's fascinated by this idea of reintegration. We know something happened to her mother in season 1. Her mother had passed away, and she still has the oxygen mask and the tubes that she had in the hospital when she has that breakdown at the end of season 1. So there's something to do with her relationship with her mom. For some reason, she's fascinated with this idea of what the innie technology can do. She is once again very interested in proving that Petey has somehow reintegrated himself. So she definitely wants back in. So we still don't know what her broader agenda is, but that is what's primarily motivating her, which I do think is interesting here. And maybe that is why, to some extent, Lumen, the leadership there, is a little wary of her, because maybe they know that she's not in it just to protect Lumen. She's in it because she's vested in the outcome of this experiment. So she might be in it just for her own reasons. But speaking of wanting to go back, speaking of wanting to go in there for their own reasons, Bert, his outie, we still don't even know the full extent of this, obviously is conspiring with somebody about getting back in there, and is very upset about his innie being fired. And this happens very quickly, as is Dylan fired as well. Dylan's upset, his outie's upset, not because he obviously has any additional knowledge. He just is thinking, how am I going to support my family? How am I going to tell this to my wife? We have 3 kids at home, presumably a stay-at-home wife, and he needs to provide for them.
I loved the cover story about getting into a fight about something and the way that each of them are so perplexed at what's happening. I thought it was just fun to watch.
I think that Irv suspects that something happened to his
I
innie.
think Irv suspects a lot of things.
Yes, he does. Absolutely.
But he's not able to put his finger on any of it exactly. But his mind, the gears are turning in his mind, I feel.
Yeah, as opposed to Dylan, who's just like, what? Like, really seems blindsided. And Irv kind of feels like, oh, something that he's been working on has finally clicked into place.
Yeah, you see it even in his reactions to Milchik, right? Of like very questioning of the story he's being told.
Yeah, how about Milchik wanting to step inside for a moment? He's just like, no, don't go into my my bazaar. I mean, if Milchik sees all those paintings in the house, he's going to be lots of questions.
It has a little feeling of like, you don't have to invite the police into your house just because they ask.
Right, exactly. A good rule of thumb for all the good legal rule of thumb. At this point in the episode, this is when we see the new intro. I know you love the intro for season 1. What did you think of this one?
This one was overwhelming to me. I was so distracted by the onesie that Mark is wearing.
Yes.
And then the floating heads. And then there was cereal. I'm sure you have a much more detailed, orderly note of all of the things that happen in this intro. But it just, to me, I appreciate the work that went into it and that they are trying to give us hints of things and refer to things. But honestly, on my first single watch, it was a little bit overwhelming and felt very long.
I'm not going to spend too much time on this, although we could probably go frame by frame for an hour.
Right, exactly.
I don't want to go crazy on it, but I do want to call out a few things that I think are important. First of all, just the design of it is really beautiful, right? As you mentioned, he's in this onesie the whole entire time, which also makes you think about children. He's at the beginning, the animated version of, I guess it's his outie actually waking up in his own bed, right? So that's his outie version, is surrounded by these babies crawling around that have no faces. They have blank faces. So that's the first thing to mention. And then there is this weird thing where their heads turn into balloons and they're floating in and they float in and out of other people's faces. Like one balloon goes in the cereal bowl and then the other Mark wakes up. So that could be some indication of something we'll see. But the things I wanted to call out here that I thought were really interesting. One is we see the back of Mark's head and we see the innie crawling out of like brain matter, basically. And then we see that it is the other Mark pulling the chip out of the back of his head, right? Of his own head in a way. So I do wonder if we're going to see some physical reversal of of actual removal of this chip at some point in this season.
That was the final shot, right? That was the last thing that happened.
It's actually pretty early on. Towards the end.
Then. Yeah. Tell me what was the last thing that happened then? Because that seems similar, no?
Yes. So the very end is when you see an actual eye peeking out the back of his head.
Okay.
But earlier there's an actual innie inside of a brain, basically, and pushing the chip out. And then the other Mark, like this little version of him, is pulling it out the back of his head. That's intriguing. Not that physics that is actually going to happen, but just the idea of the removal of the chip at some point, which might be part of this reversal process. But then we see something really intriguing towards the very end of the episode. First of all, it's when like those heads are all floating, etc. But then we see this face, like a giant light, like looking down at the Mark character. And then when it looks up towards the camera, it's obviously Selvig, but with this face that is like basically like a flashlight. And then the camera goes into it. It's like a hallway. And we go to the end of this dark hallway and we see Gemma, but Sona, for the last split second, right before the elevator door closes, it's Heli. So it's Gemma and then becomes Heli just for a split second. And I don't know what that means. I don't know.
Interesting.
Mark wakes up again, the Audi Mark, but now there is a baby still in there covered in snow. But now the baby doesn't have a blank face, actually has Kier's face, the bearded face of Kier. And then, the camera spins to the back and we see his hair separate and there's this eye, which of course we assume is the innie trying to get out. So yeah, very evocative. And I do wonder what it means, how those are going to be clues for what happens later. I think we'll circle back to some of this when some of this becomes more well-defined over the course of the season. Okay, back in the episode, we're at Devin's house now again. Of course, Milchik has just fired Dylan and Irv. I love Rickon getting rid of this character, Rebecca. It's funny because he has quite some tolerance for these crazy people who follow around him, but he seems to be really irritated with Rebecca. He actually thinks she's coming back later on. He's like, oh no, it's her again, but it's not. It turns out to be Milchik. But what do you think about these interactions between Devin and Mark?
Devin already knows what the inside Mark was referencing when he was screaming, she's alive.
But does she? She sounds like she's saying, yeah.
I think she's trying to convince herself that is so crazy. That couldn't possibly be it. So what's the only other option is that it's about the baby and the lactation fraud. I love that. I think she has an instinct that it's not. But she's trying to figure out the rational explanation, right? Like you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras, right? Like, well, it had to be that because what else could it be? But I think she already is worried about what else it could be. What did you think?
It's interesting because she seems to be the one who's pushing for it's obviously the baby. Of course, it had to be the baby. Let's do Occam's razor here. And it couldn't possibly be about your wife. Or she says, assuming it's not about Gemma. And he's just like, why are you saying it that way? Right. But it really seems to be eating away at her. They have a later scene, obviously, at Pip's. Not the best place to go, by the way. And I was saying to my wife when we're watching this, I wouldn't go have breakfast at Pip's. They might have somebody there listening in. And of course, like the camera turns around, it's like, there he is. There's the person listening in on the conversation. Although he might have just been following him anyway. But it's funny that they would choose to go have breakfast in Pip's. But even then, at that later conversation, even more so, she's really pushing the whole Gemma thing. So it really makes me wonder what her agenda is. Maybe I'm getting too conspiratorial here. And maybe it's Milchik's visit. So maybe I'll trust her on this, that she's just a little suspicious of it and a little wary of it. And then it becomes more pronounced after Milchik gets there. Maybe she gets to be even more wary of what's going on with inside of Lumen. Before we move on to Milchik's conversation with Mark, I did like some of the things that Rickon mentions here, how he keeps pushing in the fact that Patton really, he didn't find the baby. He really did rescue her. Like he's pushing for that version of things. If you haven't, and you haven't rewatched it, but it's very funny when it's actually Mark who finds the baby and then picks it up, and then Patton takes the baby out of his hands, basically. And he's like, I saved her. I saved her. So it's very funny to see this interpretation of it, considering how little he was involved with it actually to start with. Also love the fact that even though Audi Mark is pretty dismissive about all his books, that Innie Mark was very moved by this book.
Yes.
So that's a very, very important to him, that he's just like,
he likes that guy.
He loves that guy. Exactly. He's his biggest fan. And then the doorbell rings and Rickon is annoyed, thinking it's Rebecca yet again, probably forgot something else. But no, it's Milchik. Devin is great in this scene, just how protective she is of her brother. And he starts asking questions like, what did he say to you? And she says, if I tell you, are you going to punish him? And Milchik is so annoyed with her, just gives her this dead-eyed stare, being like, we don't do punishing.
We don't punish anyone.
Of course not, right? As we've seen there. It's interesting, though, that Devin has to lead even Audi Mark to be outraged by this. She's the one who brings up the whole fact that Cobell was there. And he's like, yeah, she's my neighbor. That's pretty messed up. But it's almost like Devin has to get him there. So do you think that indicates that Mark still at some level wants to go back to work? And she almost needs to encourage him to be more outraged? Like, how did you read those scenes?
I think a lot of this, and I only watched it once straight through, so I'm struggling a little with the sequence of events. But I think for Mark, what really comes to the surface here, and maybe more in that second conversation with Milchik, is the pain that he was in, grieving and trying to escape it, and the relief of having that escape. And I think he's struggling with like that pain hasn't gone away, right? He hasn't coped with it. He's still living that trauma. And now somewhat anew, even if he hasn't at this moment in the episode processed that yet. Yeah, I think it's a struggle because like this was his fix for the situation. And so you don't want anybody then putting that at risk because it's the only way you're surviving.
And there's something really interesting that happens here as well when Milchik says to him, once again, manipulating people with the truth, Milchik really does seem to have an affinity for the Mark Innie and says to him, what he did today was unlawful, unauthorized, and dangerous, but it was also very brave.
Yeah.
And do you want to reward that bravery with non-existence?
Yeah, that was an interesting comment. I'm not sure
it's a
what to make of
manipulation,
it.
right? Because
Yeah.
at all costs, they have said to Milchik multiple times, all that matters is getting him to finish Cold Harbor. We have to talk about that, obviously, when we get to it.
Yes.
Episode. But that's the only thing they care about right now. This is the manipulation for sure by Milchik. But this actor does a really good job, I think, of showing when Milchik is saying something that he believes in. So I think he does want to save these innies, but as we mentioned in episode 1, he is feeling the disrespect that Selvig probably dealt with, or I should say Cobell dealt with, now that he has that same role.
I wonder if he got his computer screen changed yet.
Have they changed it yet? Well, I did. This is actually synchronizing with the end of last episode. So the answer is no, he has not.
Right. You're right. I wasn't thinking about that. The timelines. Yes.
And then, of course, we get, we've already briefly mentioned it, but Helena watching the videotape and seeing Her Innie interacting with Mark S. And incredible face acting here by Britt Lauer.
Yes.
What did you think about this whole sequence, which I just thought was maybe the highlight of a really great episode?
I mean, she's fascinated, right? She's just rewinding it and pausing it.
Right.
I think maybe trying to imagine what that felt like for that version of her. Mm-hmm. Because maybe that's a feeling she's not super familiar with in her outside life, and probably fascinated by this idea of this whole other life that her inside version has with feelings and romantic interests and physical feelings as well as emotional feelings. And all of it is, I think, fascinating to her. And it seems that she kind of longs for that.
And just that whole interaction, which again is such a great scene in season 1. Even watching it on loop here, the clever way she like laughs and they make that joke about maybe we'll be married to each other on the outside and we'll be in the middle of having a fight over like
car wash coupons.
You're cutting them wrong. You're clipping them wrong.
Well, and also that statement of like, in case we don't make it back.
Right.
Or
exactly.
in case we do.
Right. Exactly.
That's great.
Yeah. So all of that. And like you said, she's vicariously living through this rewatching of the thing, which makes me think about reality TV, right? All these people who live usually mundane lives, which you would assume these innies are basically living very, very rigid routines.
Yes.
And then theoretically living through vicariously through the TV we watch, the movies we watch, the reality shows we watch. And in a way, she has her own reality show because she gets to watch Her Innie. But I do find it so fascinating that you can just go and see an alternate version of yourself in a different circumstance, living this other life. I never considered that as an option here for, one of the lures of this severing process.
Yeah.
I don't think she has understood that either until this moment.
Yeah. It's a whole almost like sliding doors situation.
Exactly.
That movie from the 90s. I think when she signed up for this, I don't think she foresaw that as a situation she would be in and feelings she would have. It probably is very disconcerting to know that this other version of her is having all these experiences, not just looking for scary numbers or however they explain it.
Yeah. And also the fact that Her Innie is just such a different version of herself, right? She's funny. She's all these things that she is not, right? She's always thinking about what she's saying in public and being watched. It is funny to think about the finale of season 1, when Heli is suddenly inhabiting her body, she's so wary of saying the wrong thing in this public. Oh, what if they know it's me? And her Audi version is not that different because she is also constantly performing for her dad or for the board or for even doing the statement this week, obviously, explicitly doing a performance. So it's funny
that one was bizarre. I was on a prescription for an arm brush. I mean, that is
non-Lumen product, though, non-Lumen medication.
Yes.
That is very funny, by the way. Like that happens when people are saying, like, I was on this drug that was prescription, was not not recreational, where there's all these public statements that have all these caveats on them. So it's like no one can misconstrue what I'm trying to say here.
It would have been way more believable had she blamed Ambien. I've heard some crazy stories about Ambien. I mean, like a psoriasis cream? I don't know. You had some bad eczema and then I don't know.
RFK is going to be right on banning that arm cream.
Yeah.
And then we have another great scene. Dylan goes for his job interview at this
love this
door company. This guy's like a mirror image of him. I like when they both sit back.
Yes.
It's like, this is an older version of him. This is another one of those, that guy's, he's, character actor that shows up in a lot of TV shows, is questioning him here. And he does a really great job at first. I love how well the interview goes until it goes really, really bad. But first of all, he's just like, I've always dreamed of selling doors. Totally made up, obviously. And then he realizes that even though he just made that up, all of a sudden he's really simpatico with this guy. I love when the guy asks him, what kind of door would you be? I don't know if you have a preference, Sona. I love that he picked a pocket door, by the way, right? He was an innie. So it's like, yeah, perfect metaphor for his whole existence.
Oh, that's a good point. I was too busy thinking about how much I hate pocket doors in that moment.
I like those big barn doors, the ones that slide, but they just take up
that's like second on my list after pocket doors of doors I hate. Really? Where I've encountered those most often is in a hotel bathroom. And you need a proper door on a hotel bathroom. I mean, if you're staying with anybody else, this is like the least practical use of a barn door that I've ever seen in my life. And it just must be like hundreds of dollars cheaper because they're all doing it.
I don't think it's cheaper, actually. But what's your issue with the pocket door?
I don't care for it. It seems too insecure to me. Like there's, you're kind of like fighting with it to close it all the way. It doesn't quite hit the other side the way you want it to. At least that's the one in my house. I have this issue.
I know you have one, right? Yeah, exactly.
You have to really be like, I am closing this door, darn it. Which when my child tries to do it for emphasis, because it's on his bedroom, it's very loud. I like a proper door, maybe with a dark wood stain and maybe like an inset glass panel would be nice.
Oh, wow. Very fancy.
Yeah, I kind of want to switch some of our doors to that type of look. So I actually have given this some thought. Although that's not necessarily saying if I could be a door, what would I be? But
exactly. What door represents you?
Yeah.
I did like the pocket door answer, though, especially I was like, immediately, I'm like, of course you would like
a good answer. Door. Yes.
Just gets out of the way when unnecessary.
Unobtrusive.
And then, of course, things go bad. Things start going bad, by the way, when he makes the door prize joke.
Yes. He didn't care for that. Right.
He didn't like that. I guess because the door prize is something you just get for showing up. And he does not like that correlation to the word door, which, of course, is very important to him. And then worse yet, he's like, well, let's take a look at your work history. What were you doing at Lumen? Well, I got to be honest with you. I was a Severed. And this guy does not like Severed. Of course, again, showing that the further you get outside of Lumen's town that they seem to control primarily, this is a very unpopular thing. And he's not going to hire Severed there. Like, this is some kind of carpet factory over here. We make doors.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like a civil rights litigation waiting to happen almost, right? The way he's talking about Severed people.
Although it's so unpopular, I think we maybe not get much traction. I do like the fact that he thinks like, we have standards here, not a carpet factory.
Yes.
And Dylan's response to that, he's like, what?
Yes.
Maybe he'll go to a carpet store next. Although
notorious for their flexible morals at the carpet factory.
They'll hire Severed people without asking any questions. It's interesting, by the way, I forgot to note this, but I'll bring it up right now. It's interesting that they tell Mark that it's been 5 months, where it is pretty clear that this has all happened in a really short period of time, right?
Yeah.
Not only do we see Dylan looking for work, which probably took weeks, but the first time that Milchik talks to Mark, he's like, I hope to see you back on Monday. And he's like, no, I'm going to quit. And then he meets with his sister, and we got to talk about that conversation right now. But she says, I thought you were going to quit. And he's like, well, I was thinking about it. I'm going to call them tonight. And she specifically texted him, last night was really weird. So this is last night she's meeting him for breakfast. And then, of course, we see him outside of Lumen, and he doesn't go in, but then eventually he does go in. But this does not seem to have happened over the course of a month, even weeks. It seems like this is all happening within a week or so.
Yes, agree.
So then they go to have breakfast at Pip's. Yeah, they have this Cobell naming, which I love. Devin, after thinking about it, is now pushing him pretty hard to be like, don't you want to know what if it has something to do with Gemma? How did you feel about this? There is a reading of this that she knows more than she's letting on to. But then in rewatching this, and I thought about that when I first saw this scene, because there's some weird things about Rickon too, and maybe how Rickon might be connected to them, just that his philosophy seems to line up with some of the things. That's part of maybe why his philosophy resonates with the Innies. So there's some aspects of that. And I'm like, well, does she know more about what she's saying? But maybe it's just the outrage over Milchik's conversation the night before, her feeling like they're definitely covering something up.
That's how I read it, is the latter version. Not that she knows anything, but that she is suspecting that something is not quite right. And the only way to get to the bottom of it is if they investigate further.
And we didn't know much about the car accident itself, but it is pretty interesting that he brings up the fact that you think I'm crazy, that I didn't see the body. I identified her body. And then when he says that,
burned body, doesn't he say that at some point?
Yes. First, he's like, I identified the body. I, of course, knew it was her. And she's like, I understand. But don't you want to know? Wouldn't you want to know more? And he's like, what else do I need to know? And then he says, when he's yelling at her, basically saying that if your husband's body was found burned, and I'm like, hold on a second. So if her body was burned, are you sure about the body you identified? So yeah, there is a lot of questions here.
At the time, I thought there must have been some distinctive jewelry or something. Then if the body was burned, wouldn't it have melted? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, they could go with dental records, but people can falsify the dental records potentially, you know, theoretically. I mean, if she worked for Lumen, they had access to her medical records. Who knows, right?
Oh, and before we get too far astray, I just want to also comment that I loved the Milchik pineapple.
Yes. And as a matter of fact, towards the end, Selvig brings that up, right?
Yes. Did he bring you a pineapple?
Was there a pineapple involved? Bobbing for pineapples, by the way. Remember, lots of pineapple references. Oh, I forgot to mention this. In that video last week, Sona, the training video, did you recognize the voice? I didn't. I couldn't place it. I recognized the voice, but couldn't place it.
I was going to say saw it in the credits, but no, I think this is another piece of information that I just came across inadvertently, that it was Keanu Reeves.
Yes, I heard it.
Amazing.
I read it in a headline also. I did not realize it at the time. Yeah.
Amazing. I love it.
Yeah.
He's got to be one of the most likable people.
He really is.
In show business.
He's a national treasure at this point. Him and his bulletproof suits.
Yeah. So, but back to the diner. Yes.
Yeah. So I have many questions about, at this point, it's pretty clear that they faked Gemma's death. And of course, she's essential to whatever's happening with this cleansing of this Cold Harbor file. We see Irv on a payphone. We see that Bert has been observing him. He seems to acknowledge that he is there. They seem to know each other. He has this map in his pocket, Irv, that has Bert's name on it. Obviously, that's where he was headed, his Innie. But they seem to have some additional interactions outside. This is still much to be discovered about Irv, his Audi, and any relationship he might have with Bert. A couple of things that I thought interesting. One is I do feel like, and maybe this ties into the Gemma thing. I don't know why. Maybe it was something in the visuals last season in that opening credit, something to do with a drowning. So maybe Gemma actually drowned and the burned body was fake. But I do want to call that out because when we see Irv here, we see a sign that the camera spends some time on that is Lenora Lake. So I do think that this is going to be, maybe it's the lake near the Lumen facilities. I think there's going to be something related to that. Anyway, I just want to call that out here, but not that important in this particular episode. But more importantly is Irv in that same shot is in a payphone, using a payphone to contact somebody. And I would not have caught this if my subtitles weren't on, but he says, my innie got the message, and he hangs up the phone.
I did not catch that. That's fascinating.
Yes. So he obviously thinks he's communicating. My assumption here is that he thinks that he got fired because something happened with his innie. He doesn't actually understand what happened. Obviously, I don't think anybody does. It's not public record, I don't think. Although maybe it was in the news. Maybe whatever happened to Helena, we heard earlier in the episode, they were saying we've gotten our hands on all the phones and everything. But you got to assume something like that, at least a rumor of it would break out, because it wasn't only Lumen folks that were there. This was supposed to be a public event that was trying to position how great being an innie was.
Right.
So I think the media was there. I think, definitely politicians and their families were there. That's for a fact. We know that's the case. So some of this buzz must have gotten out, I assume, into the mainstream media, especially considering this is very contentious, in the culture. So maybe he heard rumors of this. Maybe there was something in the news about it, and he assumed, oh, something happened that night, and then they fired me the same night. I think my innie got the message. So I think that in some way he's not fully aware of it. But my bigger question to you there is, who do you think he's talking to? I'll tell you who I think it is. I think he's talking to Dr. Rogabi. That's maybe the only suspect I can think of. Can you think of anything else?
No, I'm so fascinated by the message that I missed. So
yeah, I was about to say, if you didn't even catch the message, I guess you wouldn't have a theory on it. What do you think about Bert being in the car watching him, and then when he exits the phone booth, he seems to make eye contact with him right before he walks away?
I definitely indicates something, but I'm a little bit at a loss as to what that would be.
Then we get another really great sequence in this episode. Milchik coming to visit Mark again in the dead of night. I guess it's winter and this is after work, so it would be dark, but it seems like every scene here, except for that breakfast scene, is in the dark.
Yeah, that's a good point now that I think about it. When we see Helena walking across that glass bridge, that's daytime. And of course, everything that happens there is daytime now that I'm thinking about it.
You're right. When she's with not the board, I guess, but they reference the board. When she's there with the other Lumen insiders, it is daytime and they're looking out the window waiting for Mark to show up. But when she walks across that bridge, it actually is nighttime. It's the night of the...
That's so interesting. In my memory, I see snow outside. That's so weird.
I think there is snow, but anyway, yeah, it's the same night. Everything happens.
Fair.
She's still in her. She's still in the gown.
Right.
But in Milchik's conversation with Mark here, it's interesting that he first says, "Well, first thing, I give you 20% pay raise. Second thing, and of course, I'm sure he knows that Gemma is on Mark's mind because he got the lowdown from their security guard or enforcer, whoever that guy is, that big burly bearded guy. He brings up Gemma, and immediately, of course, Mark's ears perk up.
Mm-hmm.
And they have this really, once again, this kind of blend of manipulation and fact. He brings up the fact that you said to us that you were choking on her ghost.
Mm-hmm.
And I know your innie. I'm friends with your innie. He's funny and he's happy. He's found love. And he goes, with who? He's very curious about that, of course, because this whole idea of, once again, Devin pushing on the fact that, don't you want to know for sure if Gemma's alive? So maybe in his mind, he's thinking, oh, there's some innie version of Gemma that is in there. I think all of this is intentional. I don't think Milchik is bringing this up naively. I think he's wanting him to be piqued, to want to investigate more, because once again, mission critical here is for him to cleanse that file, right?
Yeah. Cold Harbor, right?
Cold Harbor, right?
Yeah. I mean, these are pie in the sky promises, like, we'll do a full investigation as to all the claims. I mean, This is not reality.
And this is very touching. And once again, feel sincere moment where he says that solace that your innie has found is going to make its way back to you. I hope you'll give us that time. I love this scene, by the way, and just the way it was photographed as well, and the actors doing such a great job.
Also, coming off that diner conversation that for me was very painful to watch, because, he's basically so deep into his grief, understandably, that he's not even understanding or accepting that other people are grieving too, and demanding that his sister not be affected by it to any real extent, and saying that if your husband died, it wouldn't affect me, which really seemed like unnecessary. I think, a lot of this is showing he's in it. He's just so deep in it.
Yeah, and Amy, he's lashing out, and this happened in season 1 too. We saw multiple times where he's lashing out. He's just reading things in the most ungenerous way possible over and over again, which is how he's gotten himself into a circumstance in the first place.
I mean, I know many people who think of their in-laws as essentially their siblings. It would be devastating if they passed. Yes, not the same as having the love of your life pass, but it's nothing.
Right, exactly. And of course, this does work. The pineapple offensive works. And he brings him back to Lumen. And once again, this feels like it has been maybe a week or two at this point. Goes back, and we see the montage of the wraparound scenes of everything we saw last week. I love how, everything is like so spot on. We see him showing up, saying hi to the security guard over and over again. And then there's a one time when he walks in and you see the clock on the wall. It's 9:00. And then he walks out, it's 9:15. Security guard's like, huh? And of course, that's the last time when he has planted the message on the other Mark's jacket and that whole very funny interaction inside.
Oh, and I love that we learned that this group was, I think it was an international floater and two people who were laid off from some other group.
And we hear Bob Balaban momentarily there on the steps, furious. He's like, give me another reason to sue you guys. So I guess he may have already sued them. And they still brought him back in, I guess, just to get rid of the lawsuit potentially. All of that infuriating to him, of course, that he has moved because they were located in Minnesota or wherever it was. And now has moved as, I guess it's a fictional area in Pennsylvania. I always think about it as in New Jersey because, of course, it was shot here in New Jersey.
Right.
And then they fire him just another couple of weeks later. So all this happens in rapid succession. And of course, that also means that they also don't wait yet another 5 months for them to regroup the team. It seems that even that is happening just a week or two later as well, although it could be longer for that particular case. And of course, we see all these Lumen insiders. They've heard the message that Mark recorded. The board has heard it, and they're going to give him exactly what he wants because they have to finish the Cold Harbor file. And as I mentioned earlier at the top of this conversation, we see multiple times Mark going through and his POV changing when he goes through the elevator. We see it with Irv. We see it with Dylan. We see that funneling down of their vision, specifically indicating that they're going into their innie mode. But of course, the one character we do not see that for is when Helena gets into the elevator and the elevator doors close and we do not see her POV. So it is leaving things ambiguous as to whether that is Helena or Heli going inside. And we kind of speculated on that. I don't know if you want to add anything else to that.
No, except that I did, again, see something online. I don't know how much value these contributions have of random things that I saw on Twitter. Something about the elevator not dinging with Heli, where it dinged with everybody else, which I had not picked up on. Did you notice that?
I didn't notice that. I'm not sure if that indicates anything.
Agree.
I mean, I think it would ding anyway. I don't think it dings only when the process happens, because it's probably just dings when it moves from one floor to the other. But who knows? Maybe that's a clue of something of some kind. And then, of course, the episode wraps up with Mark and Selvig. He's outraged. We've seen this in the trailer, of course. What do you want? Why did you do this? Your cookies suck.
Yeah, the cookies. Yeah.
And she throws it in his face before she gets into the car, that Volkswagen Rabbit. We always commented last season on these old, out of date, not only the computers being out of date in this office, but the cars also probably being from the 80s. This is probably a corporate town, which was probably all stocked up. If it's still running, they never swapped them out. That's just another little detail here. But he's outraged. Why did you do this? You were in my house. First of all, she throws it in his face saying, so you went back? That's it? So easy. I thought you were going to quit. I guess you're not going to quit. So she did seem at the end of last season to be relieved at the fact that he was going to leave. Mm-hmm. And now maybe at some level is disappointed in him, although she, of course, still seems to be very vested in getting back into Lumen. And I'm sure she's going to be essential to what happens in the rest of the season. But the most important thing that happens here, of course, is all of these seeds being planted that Gemma may be still alive, Devin pushing him on it, Milchik bringing it up yet again. And now he just finally says, is this about Gemma? And Selvig, of course, stops dead. And this is a huge tell, right? I think at this point, if you have to guess what's Mark's final decision to go back and stay inside. His outie is definitely suspicious at this point, right? That Gemma is somehow involved in this Lumen conspiracy, right?
Yes, but I also think the outside version of him does not want to really dwell on this.
Accept it. But don't you think
Yeah,
that's part of
so
his motivation to go back?
I
Maybe the
do,
question is,
but
what is
I
his primary motivation for going back?
yeah, I think so, but I think it's also, to me, his motivation was more escaping this grief than it was investigating. That's how I read it from the scenes we saw this episode. Do you think his primary motivation is investigating?
I think the fact that they end it on that note
Hmm.
and that she doesn't drive away or ignore him,
Yeah, that's
it
true.
seems to be a real
Yeah,
revelation for her, like a gut punch for her. She's not expecting him to say it. And then she doesn't
yeah.
know how to react in that moment. I do agree that there's so much of him that is in denial that he just wants to come up with excuses to, like a lot of us do, by the way, to keep doing
Sure, of
things
course, of course.
conveniently because that's always your bias, right? Like I'm going to come up with a reason to not do something, right?
Yeah,
So that is what happens to all of us. This is working for him right now, and he's getting paid, and he doesn't have to deal with this half the year, half the day. All of that is a plus for him to his outie, obviously. So there is just the backsliding that can occur in that regard. But like I said, I think that they're, especially having this as the button on the episode, makes me think that it definitely is a motivator for him to get back in there. And yeah, that's where we end things for this episode. Do you have any speculation for next week at all?
I don't have speculation, but I want to know what you think about what's going on with Heli. What version of her are we seeing?
I think it is Her Innie. There's a hint, by the way. Did you watch the little featurette they do at the end of the episode? There's like a 1 minute featurette at the end.
No, I don't think I did.
There's like a really short behind the scenes and everything that I actually don't love watching these because everything that I kind of think is subtly conveyed in the episode. For example, they talk to Britt Lauer and she talks about the whole thing about Helena living vicariously through Heli. I don't think we need to have it said out loud. It's pretty clear, but there's something in the way they talk about that character that made me feel like they're trying to indicate, something going on with the character with Helena, but I still feel the same way that I did at the end of episode 1, where there might have been some negotiation. There might have been some communication with the outie and the Innie version of Heli. So she might have a little bit more information, but I don't think that that's her outie for the reasons I mentioned before. The story seems weird. It seems like they would have had a better cover story. Basically, when she's having that meeting and they're saying we're giving him everything he wants, including Heli R, when they have that conversation with her, I would assume they would have said, look, when you walk out, you're going to say the following, right? Like there would not just be like, we're just going to throw you to the wolves in there, right? But there might have been some negotiation with the Innie. They might have woken her up at some point and told her something like, if you want to really protect your friends, then you're going to say the following, you're going to play by our rules. So there might have been some intermediary awakening with her. And I do think that that's the case because there's something going on with her, but I don't think that that's her outie. That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I definitely see that option. I'm not convinced either way yet. So,
and I'm looking at the description for next week's episode, and it says Mark, Heli, Irving, and Dylan search for answers. So, not very useful. It is the longest episode so far of the season. The first episode was 48 minutes, second episode 46. Next week's episode is 53 minutes long.
Ooh.
So we will have to wait and see.
Maybe it's an extended title sequence.
It could be that. Next week's episode, by the way, directed by Ben Stiller. So Ben Stiller's back for next week.
Great.
Yeah. And I think that's all I had. Anything else you wanted to cover at all?
I'm really interested in the outside version of Irv. He seems so charismatic to me. I want to know more about his life and who he knows and what he does besides painting foreboding paintings. I hope we see more for him.
I love Torturo in general. And I'm looking at the credits for next week. And by the way, Robbie Benson is listed on the credits for next week. So
I don't know who that is.
Oh, he's just the an actor he's like a child actor from when we were kids. So I thought you might know who he was. Yeah, if you don't know who it is, just a random person who I've not seen in anything for many years. So anyway, just surprising. All right, so much more to discuss next week. Thanks again for the conversation, Sona.
Thank you. I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Okay, bye.